This is the rebuilt R80ST transmission, and I'm getting ready to install it. Now, I inserted the clutch push rod through the center of the input shaft, and I've put some Moly 60 very lightly on the splines and on the very tip of the push rod, because that runs against the clutch plate. So that'll provide a little bit of lubrication, but not enough that as it spins, it'll throw any out and contaminate the clutch plates. Now, I've wrapped the frame tubes with a plastic wrap to protect them as I put the transmission in. Now, before I install it, I'm going to attach the two wires that go on the neutral switch. And that's a lot easier with it's out of the way. This is a black, brown, and a brown. And then the other piece of it goes over to the oil low pressure sender unit. So I'm going to insert the transmission, and it's a tight fit. So if I rotate it like this and drop it down, then I can get it where I need it. And the stud here is where I'm going to hang it off that stud. There. Now, I have to get the splines on the input shaft to line up with the clutch. So I'm going to test fit it, and if it doesn't quite fit, I stick my finger in and just very gently rotate the input shaft just a little bit, and then retry it until I can get it to slide. Almost. Because you have to get the splines on the input shaft to line up with the splines on the clutch. There. Okay. So I'm going to install the lower bolt here, but that bolt also takes the ground wire on the neutral light and oil pressure switch. So I'll slide that on, and it's a tight fit. So I can get it in, and I can tighten it with my fingers, but ultimately I need a shortened Allen to be able to fit in between the shift lever housing and the bolt head. So that's how I'll tighten it up. Now, the other rear bolt slides in like this, and there's a little cutout on the transmission fin. And I can just get the washer through and the bolt head through, and then over here on the other side is a wave washer and nut that will go on, and I'll tighten that up finger tight. Now, what I like to do is tighten up two of the bottom bolts, alternating each side and snugging up the transmission to the engine block. And there's a set of ears inside here that have to slide into the bell housing. So I make sure that it goes smoothly, doesn't jam, and when I'm done, there shouldn't be any gap here at the bottom. And on the other side, I don't have a gap. I've got a little shadow, but no gap. Now, these are just sort of snug, not tightened all the way, because next I'm going to install the air box on top of the transmission, because it uses the upper bolts here to secure it. So I installed the little air valve in the bottom of the air box. Now, the air box is going to slide on top, and this stud and then the bolt here, and there's a third one in the middle, secure it. So it just slides in like that, and over the stud and up tight. Now, the other thing I have to attach is the rebreather line here. So that goes into this hole in the cover. So I'm going to secure that and then put it on the stud. Now this is the stud, so there's a nut and a very, very thick flat washer, and I like to also use a wave washer next to the nut just to make sure it doesn't back off. So that just goes on there like that. Now over here is a long bolt like the bottom bolt on this side, and another thick flat washer, and I use a wave washer, and that goes in on this side. Now these two top fasteners are what help secure the transmission to the engine block. So when I tighten them, I'm going to make sure the gap between the engine block and the engine is uniform and tight. And then there's a short center bolt with another thick flat washer that goes in the middle like that. There we go. So that's how we secure the airbox to the top of the transmission, and at the same time secure the transmission to the engine block. Now that the bolts are tight, I just check, and you can see that the transmission is flush with the engine case. There's always a little gap up here. Don't worry about that. And same on the other side. The transmission case is nice and flush with the engine. So it's bolted up, and that part of it's done. So I'm ready to install the clutch throwout rod and mechanism. And this is the piston that goes on the end of the rod that pushes the clutch open. And I applied a little R80ST to the end of that rod, and I put some 80-90 gear lube on the piston, and I just slide that in and push it all the way home. And then the spring goes on, and the rubber cover goes over the spring, and then it secures the rubber cover onto the housing with this little clamp. So that's all there is to putting that mechanism together. Now I'm going to install the clutch throwout rod. I put a little bit of R80ST in the needle bearing here, and this is the part that pushes on the push rod, and it slides in like this, and the end here goes inside the little rubber bellows, and then it goes in between those ears, and there's a bolt that holds it, which I also coated the shank of the bolt with a little R80ST, and just sort of push it in until it goes into the bearing sleeve. And then what I'll do is put a little blue Loctite on the end and the nut and wave washer, just to be sure that that nut doesn't come loose. So I'm ready to install the shift lever, and it mounts here on this tapped hole in the frame, and it has a special bolt here, and there's a O-ring, and it goes in like this, and I also put some grease on the shank, and then the other O-ring goes on here, and it just screws into the hole, and then I will attach the shift linkage, which goes between the shift lever on the transmission and a pin that goes on the back here. I put a little grease in these cups, and they snap on like that. There we go. And I'll get the one on the back. There it goes. Now there's a little retaining pin here, and it sticks through a little hole and pivots along the edge here to hold the cup onto the button there. Well, I tried the two rubber O-rings, but as soon as I tightened them up, they just squished out of the way. So I'm not convinced those are really what should go there. Instead, I removed them and I put a flat washer behind the shift lever up against the bushing here in the frame, and I think that's going to work just fine. So I'm ready to install the speedometer cable, and there's a bushing here that fits in this hole in the back of the transmission, and it has a slot cut in it. So you rotate it so the slot lines up with the bolt here, and I'm just going to test the bolt to make sure it will go in, and it is. So I'm going to back it out a little bit now, and then the bushing on the speedometer cable slides all the way down, and the bolt is what keeps the cable in the housing. So I'll just snug it up. Now the ground wire from the battery will go on here also, so I'm just going to leave it temporarily like this, and then this rubber boot snaps down over the bushing, and that boot's very, very important because this is a way for water to get in the transmission. So you want to be sure that that boot is fitting nice and tight to keep water from getting into the transmission. Now I routed the speedometer cable along the top of the engine here, and then it comes out right next to the horn, and then it slides over on the other side of the steering head and comes up and attaches to the input drive to the speedometer with this nut. So it's all installed. So I installed the clutch cable and routed it down under the dash here. Then I brought it down this way through the tubes and then down this way, and then it goes down under the push rod tubes and over to the back of the transmission housing. And I cut off a piece of coat hanger at 201 millimeters in length, and I butt it up against here, and then it should just about reach just about the beginning of the barrel on the end of the clutch. Now you adjust the length of that cable by adjusting this adjuster here, and then you use the nut here on the throwout rod to make the adjustment for the free play of the lever at the handlebar. So that's what adjusts how free the lever is before it engages the clutch. So that's how you install and adjust the clutch cable. Well, the transmission's installed now with the shift lever connected and the clutch cable set up and the speedometer cable. So it's all good to go.